Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Einstein Forum. My name is Misha Gabovich, and the event that you're here for tonight is an event in the ongoing series People, Things, and Animals, which is devoted to discussing new understandings of the relationship between people and other actors. And I'm extremely happy to be able to welcome Laura Centemeri as my guest tonight. Laura, hello.
Hello, Misha.
Laura is a very accomplished and versatile sociologist who is originally from Italy, has also worked in Portugal at the University of Coimbra, and is now at the CNRS in France. And she specializes in particular in environmental sociology. And full disclosure, Laura and I, along with two other colleagues, have actually been working on two papers together for quite some time. But before that collaboration started, I read with great enthusiasm the book that we're going to discuss tonight, a wonderful little book about the permaculture movement. And in fact, reading that book was one of the things that made me think that we really need to organize something like this series. Because I think it's an extremely interesting look at a movement which at first glance might appear like something a little strange and exotic, people getting together to engage in a particular form of gardening, and maybe upon a second look might look like some implementation of the idea of sustainable development. But actually, it's much more than this, and the way that she analyzes it, I think, can give us lots of impulses for understanding not just environmental movements, not just social movements in general, but really fundamental questions about how we as humans can live together with each other, but also with our natural environment, not just in the abstract, but in every specific place in which we find ourselves. So I will stop here because I don't want to take too much time from our discussion. Laura, the floor is yours.
Yes, thank you very much, Misha, for inviting me tonight to speak about my work on environmental activism and the permaculture movement. And it's really a great honor. So I'm looking forward to your question in our discussion. So we have agreed that you can interrupt me, and so to have a more lively presentation. So I have decided to start with some pictures. So these are pictures by the Italian photographer Luca Quagliato. And Luca has started in 2016 together with the journalist Roberto Maggioni, a project called The Soil Underneath, so La Terra di Sotto in Italian. And La Terra di Sotto is a project of photographic mapping of the polluted areas of Lombardy. So Lombardy is a region of northern Italy, you see in the picture. And this region is among the most polluted regions in Europe, with over 900 contaminated sites. And as Luca and Roberto write on the website of The Soil Underneath, we step on the soil of these sites unaware of their past while doing ordinary activities like walking the dog, going for a stroll, or riding a bike. We pass through these sites by car or train. We got used to consider them part of the landscape. In the soil of these sites, there are pollutants of all kinds while life flows normally on the surface. It is this normality that the soil underneath wants to map. So what is this toxic normality the result of? So let's just check the three pictures I've showed you. So this is the Calchitaigi area in Milan. So it's an area in the city of Milan, an ex-quarry turned into an illegal landfill, then incorporated into the urban fabric and ready to be transformed into an area of construction. 1,100,000 cubic meters of urban and industrial waste were buried in this area of 260,000 square meters with no control. The pollutants have reached progressively the groundwater, but in 2010, without any environmental impact assessment, a construction project was approved on the area. And the construction site was closed when the scandal exploded, following an inquiry that brought to a trial against city officials, entrepreneurs, and the regional IPA. And this picture was taken in Broni. Broni is a small town famous for its wine production, and the presence of the fibronite factory. Fibronite had been producing asbestos-based products from 1932 until 1994, and thousands of workers were exposed to asbestos until the 80s. And in Brony, workers brought asbestos back home on their work overalls, involuntarily exposing their families to the poisonous dust. They built the roof of their houses using asbestos. They built a cinema in the primary school using asbestos. And the school is now permanently closed, and it is the school that you see in the picture. And 1,000 people died in Brony because of asbestos-related illnesses. And this is the Selfanesco Street in Milan, in the city of Milan, an area of 10,000 square meters at the margin of the agricultural park of South Milan, a place for illegal waste dumping under the control of organized crime. Stolen cars and trucks were burned here. For years, from the Selvanesco Street area, toxic smoke charging dioxin reached the sky every night. And in addition, hazardous waste such as asbestos, pharmaceutical waste, rubbers, and plastics of various kinds were buried here, just a few steps away from the cultivated land and the farms of the agricultural park. And after a first phase of superficial cleaning, the area is still in need of a serious reclamation. And you can notice some recurrent patterns in these stories involving corruption, exploitation, criminality, profit, denial. And I would like to add a last picture. This is a picture that Luca took in the oak wood of Seveso, which is a very special place in general. And for me in particular, since I did my PhD thesis on the Seveso disaster and its socio-political and ecological consequences. And here in the picture, you can see a bird watching facility inside the oak wood. So the oak wood is a urban forest born from a reforestation project started in the 80s in the so-called A-zone of Seveso. The A-zone was the most seriously contaminated area following the dioxin cloud that accidentally came out from one of the reactor of the Icmesa chemical factory on the 10th of July, 1976. So Seveso was in fact the city that suffered the most serious consequences following the industrial disaster, an industrial disaster that played an important role in the emergence at the European level of a legislation to regulate the risk of industrial disasters, the famous Seveso Directive. And so where the oak wood stands today, there were once houses, a part of the city that has been destroyed, and the contaminated waste produced during the contamination procedures were buried into two special landfills together with the animals that have been suppressed as preventive measure. And these landfills are beneath the oak wood, and they are more or less regularly checked, and they are still there with their toxic heritage. So another example of a quite strange normality, in this case, a quite strange natural place that the project, the soil underneath, tries to grasp. So
maybe you can say just two more words about the Seveso disaster, because I think it's so important, and you're assuming that everybody knows about it, but I think it's so central to also the history of European environmental regulation.
Yes,
that maybe it's worth saying a few more words about it.
Yes, I mean, the Seveso disaster is really the first big chemical accident that happened in Europe. So at the time, as you were mentioning, the European community has not environmental agenda in 76. I mean, environmental issues were not taken into account at the European level. But the Seveso disaster showed that it was not possible to address this issue at the European level, because the accident was caused by, I mean, a malfunctioning inside in a chemical industry, which was owned by a multinational, Hoffmann La Roche. And the malfunctioning was clearly related to underinvestment in the security of the facilities, because Italy has a low level of controls on industry at that time. So there was a sort of dumping at the European level, in which dirty productions were moved to Italy and other countries with less constraining regulation. So it was clear that it was necessary to address the problem as well of, the industrial secrecy on what was produced inside the chemical factories, because at the time chemical factories were not meant to communicate what they were producing. So, and let's say that it was the first case of a massive spill of dioxin on inhabited areas. I mean, previous accident involving dioxin concerned exclusively workers. And it was the first, let's say, global showed disaster, because it was widely communicated on TV screens and journals, and the images were like the images of the nuclear apocalypse, because people wearing white suits to protect from dioxin, and a part of the city completely evacuated, so with displacement of people. It was really the scenario thought for the the nuclear accident. It happened with the chemical contamination, but let's say that the disaster was an important moment in the construction of a European environmental consciousness. And since Seveso, then the environmental issues were became central in the agenda of the European Union. And I mean, in Seveso, the disaster was, of course, a very dramatic event, but extremely controversial, and the sources of a lot of conflicts. And that's why, I mean, Seveso was for me a sort of introduction into the complexity of environmental activism, because different forms of activism reacted to the Seveso disasters, and that's what intrigued me, to understand the different ways in which the same disaster could be seen as a stake of engagement, but these forms of engagement were really different in the way to conceive what was necessary to do in the face of the environmental catastrophe. So, I mean, today I will come back to this variety of forms of engagement that I could observe in the Seveso, in the reconstruction of the Seveso disaster, but also in the current reality of Seveso. And I want just to reflect on how we can define these landscapes, like the oak wood or the previous landscape that I showed you. I mean, they can be defined as negative externality. They can be defined as damages, environmental damages, as situations of risks, of situation of of socio-ecological injustice. They are, I mean, cases as well of environmental crimes. But I mean, today, my invitation is to observe this landscape as ruined social ecosystems in need of repair. And ruined social ecosystems are socio-ecological systems that have lost their diversity in terms of populations, functions, interdependencies that are off balance, that have been exposed to contaminations and that are at risk of breakdown. So their ruination has been actively caused by man-made transformations that have provided the exchange or value extraction. So in ruined socio-ecological systems, while some species thrive, others strive to survive. And ruined social ecosystems are the soil in which inequalities of all sorts grow. And what ruination leaves are ecologies of remains. And so I want to go back to what kind of activism in ruined social ecosystems. And as I was mentioning before, I started to explore this issue during my research on the Seveso disaster, because in this post-disaster situation, people engaged at least in three forms of activism. They engage in order to protect the environment from further destruction through protesting against ecologically harmful plants. And you see on the left a demonstration against the project of incinerator in Seveso that was planned by the government to dispose of the contamination toxic waste. And the Oakwood is the alternative project that won at the time against the project of the incinerator. But people also engage in denouncing responsibilities for what happened and asking for reparation in the judicial sense. I mean, the conviction of the guilty, the monetary compensations, ecological restoration, symbolic reparation. And people also engage in everyday practical repairing, intended as the activity of trying to repair socio-ecological relations through ordinary practices of taking care of people, things, places, animals, plants, etc. So in what terms this direct action of taking care of a specific environment is a form of engagement? In Seveso, I met this group of activists of the NGO Legambiente, who since the 90s have been supporting in Seveso the idea that through practices of taking care of a damaged environment, it is possible to express a form of non-confrontational critique, still a somehow radical critique. So repairing is intended by these activists as an opportunity to reflexively change the way to inhabit an environment. So to change the way to inhabit an environment means to change in everyday activities the ways in which we value and we evaluate things, beings, situations, activities, because I mean, these ways we have to value and evaluate give rise to regular patterns, to habitus that have an impact on ecologies. So these activists considered that a reflexive revision of how people define and attribute value to beings, things, environments, activities, etc., is a key dimension in the process of re-inhabiting after the catastrophe, because they concretely were confronted with let's say the goal of being able to re-inhabit the place of a catastrophe. And the way they found was to engage in repairing, in practical repairing. So maintaining and taking care of, for example, natural spaces. And so for these activists, practices of repairing became politics by other means. And I mean, the emphasis was really put by these activists on the importance to use this practical engagement in repairing as a way to work on the way people attribute value and evaluate things. So it was really meant as a kind of activity in which it was possible to create a new relationality between people and their environments. So the let's say that this practical taking care of the environment become the place of creation of alternative value practices. What these value practices? Value practices can be defined as those practices through which actors individually and collectively define what they consider as valuable in a given situation and act accordingly to attain and maintain the condition deemed worthy. And when one observes value practices in their unfolding, it emerges that actors typically have recourse to a variety of modes or logics of valuation. They can value what is instrumental to a specific plan of action. They can value what is valuable according to a general definition of value. For example, they can value something because it is recyclable, because it is fashionable, because it is a civic duty, because it is technically efficient, because it is traditional. And then they can value something because of their intimate relationship to it, or because of its singular qualities tested in an experiential way. So we can speak of the existence as well of dominant value practices, that is, those value practices that are socially encouraged, routinized and stabilized through institutional investments. And these dominant value practices rest on shared legitimate value arguments and shared socio-technical imaginaries. That is a vision of the good society and the place that science and technology have in this vision of the good society. So
maybe, Laura, maybe I can interrupt you again very briefly. I mean, I think this is a point that's very important to stress, because some of the discussions that we've had in the past at the Einstein Forum make sort of a very simple distinction between self-interested behavior and altruistic behavior. But I think it's important to stress that your approach is actually much more sophisticated than that. And, you know, it draws on a whole a sort of tradition of research, which which shows that really it's not just about whether something is in my self-interest or benefits others, but there are really completely different ways of assigning value to certain behaviors, to certain goods, etc. And it's not just about whether it benefits me as an individual or not, right? Because there are really different sources of those values, and there's more than just one or two of them.
Absolutely. So that's true that I'm not deploying the theory beyond all this, but it's exactly what you are saying, that I think that the dualism, self-interest, or or altruism is not, I mean, is too limited. And the real, or at least in my sense, it makes sense to really start from the way in which concretely in the relation with the material environment, one's attribute value, give value to things that we can see this much more wide variety of logics at work. And then we can arrive to self-interest, I mean, but in a second step. At the first step, I think that we have to take into account this variety of logics that are at play in the way in which concretely we are building our relationship to other people, but also with the material, with the material world. So with the environment, the living beings in the environment, not living beings. So that's for me a very important point. For in order to understand a movement like the permaculture movement, as we are going to see, because I mean, this stressing this operation of attribution of value means taking into account the way in which the operation of attribution of value is really part of the way in which we create certain kinds of ecologies. I mean, and this is where economy and ecology really are linked in this issue of value, of how we attribute value, because as our value practices are really a way of inscribing attribution of value into a materiality, which is also an ecology. And that's why I'm putting here this issue of the erosion of the diversity of legitimate value arguments, because I mean, dominant value practices, as I was saying, are related to value arguments that legitimate these practices, and these legitimate value arguments are legitimate because they are the expression of a shared socio-technical imaginaries. But what we are experiencing today is really a sort of erosion of the diversity of legitimate value arguments, because there is a sort of hegemony of profitable exchange as the logic of organization and vision of economic growth as what guarantees social well-being. So we are experiencing sort of erosion not only of biodiversity, but as well an erosion of the diversity of the legitimate ways to values. And that's why I think that all these activities of value practices and value arguments are a crucial battlefield, if of course not the only one, when trying to promote socio-ecological change. And that's where ecological prefiguration and ecotopian movements like eco-villages and permaculture come into play, because they are really acting in an engaged way through creating value practices and inscribing value practices in context and in creating institutions that are that rest on these alternative value practices. And I think that from this perspective is really easier to understand why since the 70s there has been a form of environmental activism focused on direct actions of socio-ecological change, and not only in the form of responsible consumptions, but in these prefigurative experiences of more sustainable ways of living and organizing real economy. So I think that calling it simply counterculture can be as well limited in, because I think that these movements are really pointing to this vision of value as something which is really related to the way in which we build our connection with the world. So of course is a cultural understanding of value, even economic value is an institutional and cultural understanding of value. And I think that I mean, this shift is really important. I mean, this perspective is really important in order to see in movements like eco-villages and permaculture the effort to try to to create new institutions and not just a counterculture. And so this is, I mean, this is the perspective that I've adopted in my own research on the permaculture movement. So a research that started in 2015. And so I'm in this research, I get interested in the permaculture movement at the transnational level, but then I focused on the permaculture movement in the Italian context, because I mean, my research revolves around the varieties of environmentalism in the Italian context and their change over time. So permaculture is a term that derives from the contraction of culture and permanent. At the beginning, it was agriculture, permanent agriculture, and then became permanent culture, because I mean, the issue was clearly not simply agriculture. And let's say that the decisions about agriculture are always decisions about the kind of culture and the kind of society we want. So permaculture comes from permanent and culture, and the concept and the movement comes from Australia, and specifically from Tasmania, and was developed during the 70s by Bill Mollison, an eclectic biogeographer and ecologist, and David Olgram, a student in environmental design at Hobart University. And in Australia, as elsewhere, the 70s were years of environmental struggles and countercultural movements, including the highly composite movement that has been defined as back to the land movement. And so permaculture was conceived at the beginning as a support tool to facilitate these returns to the land. So to allow people with very little familiarity with agricultural practice to settle in rural areas and to develop subsistence economies based on agriculture. And that is why permaculture is often considered as a type of agriculture, as a type of agroecology. But permaculture is not a set of techniques for doing agriculture. Permaculture is a method to design the organization of human activities, so food production, health, education, housing, in a world of energy decrease, in such a way as to promote the transition to a sustainable metabolic pattern of our societies. As a design method, permaculture consists in assembling conceptual, material, and strategic components in a pattern which functions to benefit life in all its forms. This is the definition that Bill Mollison gave of the permaculture design. And so in permaculture, human activities are seen as generating socio-ecological systems that should be designed in a permacultural way. And so permaculture is a form of design activism that promotes an understanding of design as ordinary human activity. And the permaculture movement can be considered as sort of popular education movement meant to empower people through making them conscious of their power as designers. And for example, the transition towns movement is based on the permaculture method applied to the urban space. And the permaculture method is used in many eco-villages, and you can have every type of activities designed in a permaculture way. Of course,
Laura, maybe we need to say a few words about what exactly is meant by design, because people who are completely unfamiliar with the idea of permaculture might be getting lost here. So it's not design in the sort of PR design meaning, but it's really designing one's own habitat and the local environment in which one finds itself.
Yes, I mean, permaculture really comes from a tradition of engagement of design as a form of activism in front of the ecological crisis. This is a long story of environmental design or eco-design. I mean, in this tradition, design has to be conceived as a ordinary human activity, which is the activity of, I mean, I put a quote from Ezio Manzini, which is a theoretician of eco-design. And Manzini says, design as ordinary human activity is the outcome of combining three human gifts. So critical sense, which means the ability to look at the state of things and recognize what cannot or should not be acceptable. Creativity, the ability to imagine something that does not yet exist. And practical sense, the ability to recognize feasible ways of getting things to happen. So in this tradition of understanding of design, design is really linked with a critical sense. I mean, design starts because one sees that, the state of things maybe should not be this one. And so design is then the ability to develop this intuition into something that can, at the end, really exist as in practice. And permaculture takes this vision of design and tries to, let's say, to give all the tools necessary for everyone to discover this capacity of designing, which is to critically assess and then creatively find a way to imagine and finding the practical ways to bring this vision into the reality. So that's why I stress this dimension of permaculture as a movement really focused on education, because basically it's about sharing and training to a problem-solving kind of attitude. And so design exactly is not the kind of professional activity, even if you can then have professional eco-designer and maybe even professional eco-designer in permaculture. But design should be conceived as a very ordinary capacity that everyone of us have, in the capacity to critically assess and to evaluate and then to finding ways to change things.
But what really struck me, especially when reading your account of it, was that, I mean, this is, you're now talking about design in this sort of grand conceptual way, but it can really start with like where you put your stuff in your home,
yes.
right?
Yes.
Where is the best place for each object to kind of minimize the energy that you expend on, yes, putting it kind of here and then putting it back. Where do you put your plants so that you don't forget to water them? But then it extends all the way to, entire environments, entire landscapes, and then also to thinking about society as a whole.
Yes, because I mean, the critical assessment in permaculture is based on the ecosystemic view. So permaculture teaches to see things through the ecosystemic view, and so that's why it's a sort of it changes your views on things, because you learn about the way in which ecosystems function, and you start to apply this knowledge on everyday activities, and thinking about these activities as part of an ecosystems. And so that's true that even the way you organize your desk or can be thought in terms of a permaculture design, which means something that you can, let's say, I mean, something which is related to your energy consumption. So reducing the need to bring energy from the outside to realize what you have to realize. So that's true that permaculture works both on the side of design, so in showing this potential of design as an activity that everybody can use in everyday life, and then the ecosystem understanding as the reference to critically assess your current organization of life. And yes, and so the designing systems in a permacultural way means reducing and optimizing energy inputs, increasing resilience, which means diversity and redundancies, and producing a variety of forms of wealth. And all of this is related by a principle of eco-mimicry. And eco-mimicry means imitating problem-solving strategies that are observable or have been observed in healthy ecosystems. And I mean, for Mollison and Holmgren, what is needed to support a transition towards society less dependent on fossil fuel energy and with a reduced impact on natural resources are frameworks to guide the reintegration of human activities in ecosystems in such a way as to be able to trigger virtuous processes of coevolution. And this is not just a matter of techniques, but a matter also of what I previously defined as value practices. I mean, the question is not just techniques, how I do, but as well the value practices. I mean, in what is the value that I attribute in doing what I'm doing, and these value practices, these permaculture value practices, are based on the combination of ethical principles, design principles, and attitudinal principles. So permaculture is not just techniques to design, but it's also an ethics. And this ethics is the picture you see on the right is the classical presentation of the ethics and design principle of permaculture. So the ethics are care for the earth, fair share, and care for people. So care for the earth, care for people, and fair share. And then you have the design principle, like observe and interact, pay attention, which is the fundamental principle, observation. And then, for example, use and value renewables, or produce no waste, use edges and value the marginal. These are the design principle. I mean, and these design principles are let's say, rules of thumb and problem-solving strategies inspired so that by the experience of human communities, management of environmental resources all over the world, and the observation of healthy ecosystem. But this principle can be applied to any kind of activities, not just, I mean, the management of environmental resources. And then they partially overlap with this attitudinal principle. So work with nature, not against it, and the problem is the solution. And so, but I mean, the technical solution have to be a way to comply with the ethical views of earth care, people care, and fair share. So there is a very crucial role played by care in permaculture, and there are now discussion about changing fair share in terms of future care in order to have really ethical principles all decline in terms of care. And
maybe once again, tell me if I'm interrupting too much, but I think that this is a moment where we need to stop, because one of the crucial points for me in reading your work was the contrast with the idea of sustainable development, right? Mm-hmm. You did just use the word resources, but I think it's really important to emphasize that there is a very common understanding of, you know, what we need to do in order to combat the climate crisis, etc., which is that we need to engage in sustainable development. And that essentially means that we need to continue treating our environment as a source of resources, of tools, but we just need to make care that to make sure that these resources are replenished, right? Yeah. So it's still stuff for us to take and to use, but, you know, with a view to still having some of that stuff in 100 years' time. Yeah. And I think it's really worth emphasizing how the approach that you're talking about is different, right? Because it's really not just about treating stuff as resources. It's not about treating your environment as a source of things that you can use for your own benefit. It's about approaching it with, you know, this perspective of care and seeing yourself as an integral part of the ecosystem that everything around you is also part of.
Yes. I mean, that's the point of saying that permaculture is not just a technique. I mean, it's not a technical solution. It's really a different way. Is really a new way of see things from the perspective of the human being as really part of an ecosystem, which is also a community. It's not just an ecosystem, and is really the idea of this idea of reintegrating human activities in ecosystem is like becoming part again of a community, more than human community, and care is really the guiding principle for this reintegration. And of course, this implies changing the way in which we define our needs and the way in which we provide for our needs. But it's not just changing the way to provide for our needs, it's also changing our needs, because that's why permaculture implies also a work on yourself. Working on yourself, not as an exercise, of improvement of your capacity, but a work on yourself in order to develop your sensibility of being part of an ecosystems, and so being connected and interdependent to other human beings and to non-human beings. And care is really, what care points to is really interdependency and singularity. These are the two important things for me. In the way in which I understand care as a guiding principle for permaculture. And fair share is also important, which means that you cannot, you have to redistribute, you have to, because in nature, everything return to a cycle, so you cannot just, grow your own asset indefinitely. That's why, for example, in permacultural terms, in non-limited economic growth is completely ecologically nonsense, because nothing can grow indefinitely. And so, but care is really important, because it points to this capacity to becoming part of a network of interdependencies in which you paying attention to the singularity of these interdependencies. Because even if you have a systemic view of things, you are into acknowledging interdependencies. But the difference is exactly in that permaculture is not just about ecosystem, it is really about place of living. An ecosystem is always a place in which you live, you are part of it. You cannot put yourself outside and designing as if you were outside. You are always inside, and you are part of the design. And that's why I put that. I put in my slides that the value arguments of care and distributive justice in the sense of fair share are extended from humankind to the many non-human beings and entities that guarantee life is maintained in ecosystems. And so Mollison says all are our family. And so healthcare is really taking care of soil, and soil is understood as a heterogeneous living community, not just as a kind of system in which you intervene exclusively in a technical way. And that's why I'm putting here that care can be seen in this frame as a way of engaging with human but also non-human beings, centered on paying attention to the conditions of interdependency. And caring means engaging in a situation of action with the aim of sustaining and maintaining these relations of interdependency in a way which is attentive to their singularity and the singularity of the beings involved and their well-being. And this dimension of singularity is really important, because this means that you include in your way of taking care attribution of value that are really rooted in your personal experience of this place, of this relation of interdependence. I mean, that's where, I mean, in permaculture, your experience and the experience of a specific place, of a specific environment, is really important in order to make the interdependence something which is singular to their specific context of action.
And that also means that you can't come up with a list of rules or best practices that could be applied everywhere. Exactly. And it makes it very difficult to implement this in the form of a sort of, top-down kind of policy-driven approach. Exactly. It really is something that in order to succeed, or in order even to exist, must grow from your specific local situation. Right?
Exactly, and this is really something. I mean, in my vision, this is really the key problem, which is that every time when I present permaculture, etc., the point is scaling up. I mean, how these initiatives, how these experiments can be scaled up, and the vision is not that of scaling, because I mean, scaling means formalizing something as a best practice, of a series of rules to follow. And the rule in permaculture is the rule of it matters. I mean, should I do this or should I do that? I mean, it depends. It depends. So the question is that there is no general rule. Rules depend on the situation in which you are, and so the transmission of competencies of design are meant to put the designer in the condition to be able to address the specificities in a permacultural way. But the permacultural way is the way in which, in this context, you can follow and you can comply with the objective of caring, earth caring, people caring, and fair share. And this cannot be decided in general. It depends on the concrete situation in which you are, what means taking care. I mean, there is no general rules, but there are principles that can help you, that of course you can develop skills and competencies, but you cannot follow a rule. And so that's why permaculture stresses the competencies, the development of the capacities, and not, following rules. And so I wanted to give an example of this importance in the permaculture design of the variety of logics of attributing value, the importance of this kind of attribution of value that rests on the personal experience and the singularity. And the example, the example of designing a food forest. So this example is taken from my fieldwork, so my participation in a permaculture design course. And so the topic of this seminar was designing a food forest. And the food forest is a key concept in permaculture thinking and practice. And it is the idea of designing a garden, emulating the functioning of a forest, the way the forest ecosystems is organized, in order to create a low maintenance forest garden. So in which you have food plants and trees, so you have food plants that you like to have or that you can grow there. But the idea is a forest, but is a forest which produces food. And so the teacher introduced this seminar, telling the participants that in order to address the issue of how to design a food forest, it was necessarily previously to address the question of why we want to design a food forest. And so he invited people to make a list of the good reasons for designing a food forest. And so I put the list of the good reasons that, in this seminar, people put as good reason to design a food forest. And it's good for the production of food and biomass for human beings and for all beings. It's good for beauty, for having a place to walk, to sit, enjoy reading, relax, being with friends. It's good for the rhythm of the food forest because it teaches you to wait. It's good for insects, to understand them, to let something spontaneous to happen, for the production of oxygen for the planet, for the preservation of traditional species. It's not good for money, but we can sell the surplus, recovering areas environmentally damaged, especially public areas, playing and having fun, for animals to have fun too, enjoying sounds, resilience, experiment, creating an example, and also the dream of the paradise of Eden becoming true in our lives. So you see this huge variety of good reasons. And what I'm interested in is that this list of good reasons shows very diverse modes of attributing value to the food forest. And I was interested in the fact that the teacher was the one inviting people not to stick just to very legitimate reasons to value a food forest, like preserving traditional species, production of oxygen. But it was the one inviting people to include also modes of valuation related to the experience of places, like enjoying sounds, having a place to walk, having a place to meet animals. I mean, it was really inviting people to say things about, to say what they really like, or what they personally consider as enjoyable. This was completely legitimate. And so the permaculture design is meant to find a solution to combine these logics of value in the organization of human activities. And I mean, this variety is part of sustainability. This variety of logics of value is really is one of the sources of the permanent design, because you are really into taking into account different types of interdependencies, because of course you are also taking into account scientific knowledge in judging about, the goodness of the food forest. And permaculture is really about being able to move between the different way of attribution of value, which are also different ways to know things, and so different kinds of knowledge. And the key to permaculture design is to be able to combine these different sources of knowledge and these different attributions of value in such a way as you can live well in these places, which is a places in which interdependencies are taken into account, and so a places that can contribute more in general to a more general well-being. But so permaculture is an art of reinhabiting, is an art because exactly it's not simply a technique, it's not separated from a way of life, a vision, an ethic, and work is always a form of creation and co-creation with other human beings and non-human beings. And it is an art which is meant to repair socio-ecological system. In this reintegration of human being into ecosystem, there's something about repairing socio-ecological systems, and so is an art that helps people reinhabiting ecological systems. And reinhabiting means living in a place and becoming an actor of its social, economic, ecological, and even political specific fabric, and acting to take care of it and contributing to change things through caring. And so reinhabiting and repairing do not imply to restore, I mean to remake things the way they were before. It means recreating the capacity for autonomous development, regenerating commons and commoning practices. And this capacity of autonomy is really important, but autonomy is not to be intended as self-sufficiently, as cut yourself out. Autonomous development is something which implies also solidarity, a co-responsibility. When I was saying that in considering interdependencies, for example, scientific knowledge can be useful to understand interdependencies that cannot be understood directly through our senses, through our experience. I mean, it's why in permaculture, autonomy is it goes always with a form of co-responsibility. And so the risk of remoteness is exactly the risk of just stick to your self-sufficient place. And against this remoteness, the permaculture movement encourage people to build networks and to build networks of networks. So the movement dimension of permaculture is really meant to build this connection between autonomous places, which are at the same time creating a form of co-responsibility and as well a form of solidarity. So it's really an effort to recreate forms of solidarity in an ecological way, because the issue is that of recreating solidarity, but with this reintegration of our ways to provide for our needs into the functioning of an ecosystem.
All right, we're kind of beginning to run out of time,
yes.
Because I really want to leave some time at the end for questions and comments from the audience. So maybe you could get to the specific examples
yes.
that you were going to mention. Yes,
I just want to say something about the movement, so the political dimension of the movement in terms of the kind of socio-technical imaginaries. And in my research, I found a very syncretic kind of socio-technical imaginaries of transition, the growth, slow living, conviviality, living in harmony with nature, abundance, urbanity, inclusion and emancipation, but also collapse, self-sufficiency, natural order. And yes, for my fieldwork, what emerges is that permaculture movement supports a strategy of collaboration, coalition, and alliances with other collective actors, providing tools and methodologies to organize networks of networks, and designing them as ecosystems and as ecotons, which means ecosystems of transition in which diverse forms of environmental engagement, diverse political cultures and social imaginaries can meet. But of course, this this diversity, which is considered as a value in the permaculture movement, raises the issue of conflicts and the issue of the limits of this diversity, because I mean the founders of permaculture have an idea. I define this idea, a post-political belief in the power of life as something which can make people agreeing, because they say it is possible to agree with most people of any race or creed on the basics of life-centered ethics and common sense procedure across all cultural groups. And this is not what I observed on the field, which is that life-centered ethics can be also reactionary and not necessarily emancipatory. And in my fieldwork in France, I was confronted with a far-right movement which promotes I mean, a sort of understanding of permaculture. I mean, it promotes permaculture, but it's not really permaculture. But at the same time, the techniques are the same techniques as permaculture. And so I was confronted with a very complex scenario in which, I mean, this post-political vision of agreeing on the basic idea of life-centered ethics is really too simplistic. And I wanted to give the example of care. I mean, in my fieldwork, care was, I mean, in Italy, care is really related to the Catholic political culture. And, you know, Pope Francis' encyclical letter, Laudato Si, on care for our common home, really contributed to popularize care as something related to the ecological crisis. But then in the encyclical letter, of course, you have the vision of the integral ecology as, you know, the natural order being heterosexual family. And so you have a sort of a vision of care as protecting nature and respecting natural order. And instead, you have another understanding of care, which is more intended as the production of natural culture, so that there's not really a natural order to respect, but the co-construction of a variety of local natural cultural orders that are always in evolution, and understanding of care which comes from ecofeminism. But I mean, the issue is that really I grew convinced that permaculture really tries to overcome the dichotomies that have been structuring our modern culture through reclaiming reason as the exercise of a practical art of reinhabiting. And this challenge is necessary to be able to produce new social and socio-technical imaginaries, but of course it can be diverted to support reactionary behaviors. I mean, it brings promises as much as perils. And so short lessons, I mean, for me, the lessons from the permaculture movement is really the lessons of reinhabiting as building the autonomy of territories, which is not autarky, but an endogenous capacity to define modes of self-regulation in a framework of co-responsibility, solidarity, and cohesion. But this is a political project that needs being supported beyond the local level and articulated to a new progressive socio-technical imaginary of open ecological society. And the environmentalism of reinhabiting needs to be complemented with a critical progressive environmentalism engaged in challenging current power relations and forms of domination. But the environmentalism of reinhabiting really seems to me to be the only viable way out of the technocratic grip of the Anthropocene. But a systemic change is needed to support its spreading, and it is from the collaboration and confrontation between situated practical experimentations of reinhabiting and movements fighting for radical structural reforms that the socio-technical imaginary of an open ecological society will hopefully emerge out of the combination of technical imagination and sociological imagination. And I wanted to end the way I started, that is with images of landscape, but this time landscape of reinhabiting. And so presenting you some of the projects I have met during my fieldwork. And this is the project Saya in Paternò in Sicily. And Paternò is a city known in the world for the quality of the red oranges. And the farmers here prefer monoculture, so it's the kind of, monocultural landscape with heavy consequences on the degradation of the quality of the land and the agricultural work. And Salvo, which is the guy with the white t-shirt in the picture, in 2012 an abandoned citrus orchard of about 2 hectares on the banks of the Simeto River. And when he bought the land, there were 350 orange trees, all the same variety, so the famous Tarocco variety, 14 olive trees, 2 fig trees, and the medlar tree. And since 2012, Salvo and the members of the association he created have planted 800 trees and shrubs, grafted 26 different varieties of citrus, built a water basin, set up a bio-intensive vegetable garden, and the project is overtly rooted in a permaculture approach. Salvo has created with his groups of associated an economy which rests on the selling the oranges through networks of responsible consumers, and it's working with school of the Paternò in order to promote a different understanding of the agricultural work. Another example is La Tabacca in Genoa. In this case, the project is the project of Francesca and Georgia. And it's Georgia that started the permaculture project with Francesca, her life partner, in the hills of Genoa, and both as a personal project and as a demonstration site for permaculture design within the framework of activities of the environmental NGO Terra. This is an interesting example of how a concrete experimentations of Reinhabiting is related to the work of an NGO, which is extremely active today in the Italian scene to promote agroecology. And so La Tabacca was an old half-ruined country house without a connection to the power grid or water supply network, and surrounded by 7 hectares of formerly terraced land, then abandoned. And Francesca and Georgia are working together, and you see the houses which is being restored, and the idea is to create a model to show a wider public and institution a sustainable path for the recovery of the abandoned rural properties that abound in this region, because in Italy we have a serious problem of abandoned rural areas, and so rural areas are abandoned, and the agriculture is abandoned, and so landscape are ruining literally. And another example is La Scoscesa, which is an example of one of these landscape ruining, because this is 9 terraced acres threatened by erosion, totally uphill and unsuitable for mechanized agriculture. And these 9 terraced acres have become a permaculture project thanks to the initiative of Lorenzo, which is the founder of La Scoscesa. And in the first picture on the top, you see the terrace dedicated to garlic. And Lorenzo wrote on Facebook, on his page Facebook, what is beyond such agriculture? What vision underlies growing food in this way? Can we transfer this way of designing agriculture to other realities? From my point of view, yes. I've never thought of La Scoscesa as a farm in and of itself, but as a node in a network of agricultural projects which speak of food, community, culture, and uniqueness of place. And for example, Lorenzo is highly invested in the activities of the Italian Association of Permaculture, and since he's bilingual, he speaks many languages, is also very active in the connection between the national movement and the transnational movement. And to finish, an example in Milan. So in Milan, there's not just a place of contamination, but this is the example of a city farm, old city farm, which has been restored, repaired, and is today re-inhabited by a group of 10 young people from Milan. So who began to clean and open to the public the farmhouse spaces of this farmhouse, which is Cascina Sant'Ambrogio. And recently, they got from the Milan City Council the possibility to keep on with their activities for the next 30 years, and for 30 years, and so they are implementing a variety of projects in which, I mean, a social focus is connected with an agroecological and permacultural focus. And this is the end of the presentation.
Thanks a lot, Laura. So this is really a lot of material, and I have a few questions and comments myself, but I just want to remind the audience that you are all extremely welcome to post your questions or comments in the Q&A section, in that box that you see at the bottom of your screen, and we will read them out and address them. But in the meantime, I mean, I want to try and recap what you said, because I mean, you connected this with really sort of complex and sophisticated debates in the social sciences and really in social philosophy about socio-technical imaginaries, etc., which kind of makes it sound complicated. But I think it's really about questions that we're all faced with in our everyday lives. But if I were to approach this topic, with a sort of critical, from a critical perspective, as in a sense you also do yourself in your book. I mean, so first you presented the general philosophical principles behind permaculture, where you said that it's about plural ways of valuing our environment, right? And the example that you presented of the forest that can be valued for all sorts of reasons beyond the instrumental, right? It's good because it gives us air to breathe. It's good because we can go for walks. It's good for the insects, but then it also yields fruits, etc. So it's kind of a philosophy that gives us, a handle on how we can bring all these things together, and then think about how they're all part of the same ecosystem, and how we can sort of build the world around us to make it constantly sort of regenerate all these different ways that in which we value it. But then, the specific examples that you presented just now, they're all essentially of, relatively small, circumscribed rural places, and basically, abandoned or, as you said at the beginning, environmentally damaged or destroyed places outside of, the large cities in which most of us live today. Mm-hmm. So, one could be forgiven for thinking that this is kind of an almost desperate attempt at reclamation of, otherwise abandoned rural areas. And this is something that we're very much faced with here in East Germany, right? People are leaving large parts of the region. They're migrating to the big cities. There are whole areas that are becoming completely depopulated, or there are only old people left. So then you could say, well, okay, look, here's permaculture, and this will allow 10 people from Milan or 10 people from Berlin to move to a half-abandoned villa and build something, and then they will also have a philosophy to go with it that they can use to apply for funding or to apply for a permit to stay there for 30 years. So, given this, and given the problems with scalability that you mentioned, mm-hmm. there kind of seems to be a disconnect between the very grand philosophy of re-inhabiting, being part of a regenerating ecosystem, being able to apply this to all of society and its connections with the natural world, etc., and the relatively limited practical applications that one has seen so far. Mm-hmm. So how is this different from all the many, many other utopias that have come and gone over the years and, almost the centuries, mm-hmm. where, a small group of people move out of a big city and try to start something. And then, maybe they write a book about it.
Mm-mm-mm. No, that's the question. No, I mean, the problem is that permaculture is not supposed to be only I mean, that's true that the examples I gave are all about rural example and agricultural projects, but that's true that permaculture has this ambition to be something that one can implement in her own life. So the idea is to bring permaculture in everything, but the problem is that it's extremely difficult to reconfigure permaculturally your life when you are inside infrastructures that don't leave you a lot of place for reconfiguring your ways of living. You can do it at the margin, but then it becomes really something marginal, which is positive because it shows that things can be done differently, but it's still marginal. And so I think that what is going on in the rural areas in Italy is an important phenomenon, because we have an issue with this abandoned with these abandoned rural areas. So these projects are really reactivating dynamics locally that are important to to make it more difficult for growth machines to arrive in rural growth agribusiness machine to arrive in rural areas and impose big projects of monoculture, as we have example in Italy. So they are marginal, but they are doing an important job in changing even mentality, because you can guess that the two women that are doing agriculture, they are also contributing to changing the vision of what is agriculture and how agriculture should be done. But that's true that the urban context is really important, and in the urban context, permaculture has become the transition towns movement. So, which is really, I haven't done research specifically on the transition towns movement,
but you need to explain what it is, because not everyone knows.
Okay, so the transition towns movement is exactly the idea of acting as citizens at the city level to start to find ways to reorganize in the face of the climate change challenge. And so rethink is the idea of a grassroots mobilization to find it's a sort of grassroots urbanism. So suggesting ways in which the city could be reorganized in order to meet challenges like the end of the fossil fuel era and climate change. And so I've not done research extensively on the transition towns movement. I've read about it, and it's really similar to what I've seen in general with permaculture. I mean, it depends. Sometimes it just, it turns out to be something which has become very localized, and sometimes it's totally integrated into, the kind of green vision of the new urbanism of many cities like Paris or Milan. So the example of the Milanese farmhouse is the example of a project which is living at the margins of the green growth vision of Milan, which is, okay, the city council gave them 30 years to develop their project, but they had to develop their project as entrepreneurs, innovators, into an incubators. So they are totally into, the kind of frame of innovation, not experimentation. They have to be innovative, and they are completely. They are doing, and they are faithful to what they. They are really trying to care for people and care for the earth, but they are into this. They are pushed to be young entrepreneurs that are into innovative agriculture,
disruptive.
Yes, and so they have to present projects, the kind of I mean, it also contributes to the new, for example, in the case of Milan, of the new vision of the green Milan, which is highly contestable. I mean, the landscape I've showed you at the beginning showed that Milan is not a green city, and the areas around Milan are extremely polluted, and there's no mobilization really around this issue. So, and to present Milan as a green city is a little bit problematic. But I'm working with a colleague which has studied the Indignados movement in Barcelona, and it's really interesting what I saw in Barcelona, where the permaculture network in Barcelona was really involved in the Indignados movement and in the Plaza de Catalunya occupation. And then the Indignados movement became dispersed in the city, in the different barrios, in the different neighborhoods, and they started to get involved with other local movements and occupy places and building projects. And then permaculture is interesting because it becomes the kind of ecological twist of these initiatives, which are not simply initiatives of reoccupying. They are really issues of ecological prefiguration, because you have permaculture inside, because you have this kind of sensibility that permaculture brings, a technical sensibility, but with the ecological, with ecosystemic view. And so I was really interesting to observe that if you have a movement which is a movement which succeeds in federating different kind of movements, but with a strong agenda in terms of a critical agenda, and as well a power of negotiation with the municipality power, because the question is that in Milan, permaculturists are just small groups that have to follow the rules. In Barcelona, these occupations, they are occupations. They occupy they occupy buildings, they occupy land, and then they negotiate, and they are not subaltern to the municipality. They really want to negotiate a different kind of urbanism, which is they call it a cooperative urbanism, which means that people are always users and designers and technicians. There's this idea that everybody is part of this designing the city. So your question is really important, because I can as well specify that for me the strength of permaculture is in the educational side. I mean, I think it's a good example of interdisciplinary kind of socio-ecological discipline. I mean, it is not a science, of course, but it relies a lot on scientific knowledge and of different sciences. So there is sociological knowledge about law, knowledge about architecture, knowledge about agriculture, and all this is in this vision of caring, which is also powerful. So the cultural educational dimension looks to me promising as a possibility to build, the kind of ecological culture we need if this ecological transition has to be something more than a technical fix, because if it's more than a technical fix, then we have to deal with the need to change our sensibilities, our ways to attribute value, and I think that permaculture is a sound proposition in that it is not, someone can say that it is still extremely anthropocentric, which I can agree, because I mean the designer is really the center of the permaculture vision, but is a kind of decentered anthropos, I mean, and which is into caring, which is into affection and connection, interdependencies, attachment. So it sticks to reason as important, but is not the kind of rational thinking, but it's still reasonability.
Yeah, so it's not a kind of top-down management.
And it is not. There is utility, but it's not is an enlarged vision of utility. And in my field, I was very surprised to meet a very differentiated public to permaculture events. You can find teenagers who are really engaged I found, for example, it was a young teenager who read Masanobu Fukuoka. So he was really into natural agriculture, and he was really into true concern for climate change. And then I found people with, coming from agronomy studies, and those guys told me, we like permaculture because it's not jumping into a sort of unknown spiritual or a kind of vision of things. It's really
pragmatic.
Yes, it's pragmatic. This is grounded in the scientific method in terms of experimenting, checking the results of the experimentation, taking and evaluate the feedback. So, but experimentation is really crucial. So there's something about a shared method which is experimental, but which is also experiential. That's intriguing because people are always invited to combine this dimension, which is designing and feelings. Yeah. The two are not separating, but the two cannot, one have not to overcome the other. So when I assisted to discussions about projects in permaculture, and sometimes the remarks was, there's too much heart in this, which is a lot of passion, is a lot of feelings, but is not sound what you are doing. Is not reason. There is no business plan, so you are not gonna succeed. Yeah. But in other case, the remark was, there's too much reason in your project. There's not much emotion, feelings, yourself. There's not much of yourself in it, and it's important that you are into your project with your feelings and your singularity.
Well, one of the things I found really striking in reading your book was this idea of concentric zones, which you didn't really have time to mention today, but it's one of the basic ideas, as I understand it, of permaculture, which is that you have a central zone which is very, very kind of heavily monitored and controlled and planned, because that's the zone that you use all the time. And once again, whether it's the stuff around you on your desk or the things that you grow in your garden that kind of need constant care. But then, as you move out from the inner zone to the outer zone, there's less and less control and more kind of openness to the natural regenerative processes that just happen there, in the hope of, being able to learn from the kinds of interaction that happen without you having to constantly be there and control it, right? And then when you find something interesting, like, be it the ways that, bees interact with the particular flowers that grow in your garden, right? Or the kind of decaying processes of, forests around your territory, or whatever it may be, you can learn something from that and then implement it in the inner zones. And this is something where I really understand how people may want to kind of take that and think about how to apply it in areas other than gardening and agriculture.
Yes. It's one of the tools that you are are presented in a permaculture training, and it's nothing super original, but in the way in which it invites to think things as centered on you. So I was interested in the way in which this movement also considers that taking care of yourself is part of caring for people. You have to care for people, but you have to take care of yourself. And so there's something about, first of all, be good you, and then open to the collaborations. And this kind of zone are also zone of mutual and cooperative activities. So it's because this kind of movement has really learned from the mistakes of the back to the land movement in terms of a sort of naive vision of communitarian living as something simple. They are really today they are really equipped to deal with living together. And what I saw is more and more a vision of not a community, but of hubs. Like, there's a place which is a central place, but then people have their own spaces, their own activities. So more like a federation of activities than, the kind of come everybody, we will do things. I mean, that's why in permaculture, people feel that they are not completely into a total transformation of their ways of life, but still there's a stronger change, but with some how to say repair in France. There are some that's why it's interesting for transition, because it is a way to bringing by hand to change. Like, don't worry, you can use reason, you can use utility, and to let people move to something more complex and in which you have less control, as you're saying, because it implies to not controlling everything, and to appreciate that you have areas in which you don't intervene because you can learn from these areas about. And that's why for what I saw, permaculturists are often like of sentinel. I don't know if Frederick Keck was
yes, we had him in this series. Yes.
And I was really inspired by his vision of sentinel, because permaculturists I met were really in early detectors of dynamics approaching in terms of climate change or species invasion, because they are practicing observation in a very rigorous way, and because they have these areas in which they don't intervene, and these are precious areas to understand what's going on and how to have early signs of phenomena that can be alerting.
Right. Yeah, and so I guess summing up this part of the conversation, your reply to my earlier question about how is this different from just a bunch of utopians going out there, is that we don't need to approach permaculture just through kind of its most dedicated and articulate and kind of philosophical exponents, but we can see it as a set of ideas that's kind of beginning to diffuse among various kind of interconnected movements.
Yeah.
Which maybe I'm guessing also from listening to you are more active or more visible in Southern Europe than they are in a country like Germany, for example. But then you have lots of examples of these kinds of ideas combining with sort of other projects. And I mean, I was really struck when you mentioned at some point in your book the idea that Domenico Lucano, the famous mayor who was also very heavily reported upon in the German press for kind of trying to revitalize his small southern Italian town by bringing in migrants and kind of making them learn some traditional crafts and become part of the local community, etc. And you kind of interpret this as a permacultural practice, even though he didn't really call it that.
No, but they have it. Yeah.
So if we kind of widen our lens, then we manage to see all sorts of really interesting developments and experiments that could be subsumed under this title of permaculture without really being kind of explicit examples of someone trying to implement that particular approach.
So this is I think that this is my view. I think that the aim of permaculture is to become something which is unnecessary to call permaculture.
Right.
I think that the success of the movement will be to not. I mean, it's not necessary to define permaculture because it's our culture, which is a culture of caring and fair share. And one activist told me something really interesting, which was permaculture is a form of Esperanto to help people from very different horizons and origins find a very basic shared language. And in this case, it was because, you know, you have groups of religious groups as well, practicing permaculture, etc. And the idea was that, okay, permaculture can become a sort of Esperanto for discussing the ecological dimension of things. And the case of Indignados is a little bit this kind of use of permaculture as a sort of easily understandable language in which the sociological imagination of utopian prefiguration meet the technical constraints. Because I mean, what is and I'm thinking here to Thomas Maldonado, who is a theoretician of design and eco-design, and he wrote a book about the design hope, and his vision was that you need both this sort of courage in your vision about society, but you need to have a technical understanding of the issues behind. And I think that permaculture is a way to bring into socio-political imagination tools to answer to the technical challenges of this vision. Because today, the problem of the ecological transition is we are a little bit lost in the socio-technical imagination. Because, I mean, about agriculture, we know that maybe through agroecology, we could have a different kind of agriculture, but a different kind of city or a different kind of industry. I mean, we have a lot of imagination to, a lot of imaginary to be developed in order to find a new way of organizing things. And we are really not able today to answer the kind of, people are trying to find answers about what kind of financial system, what kind of industrial system, what kind. So all these movements contribute to this technical prefiguration. And this is really important to have this technical figuration and the constraints of this technical figuration inside more radical political movements, I think, because the issue today is really to combine these two dimensions. You cannot speak about social justice without thinking about how you provide how you provide for the needs of people in a sustainable way. So, and then the let's say the dimension that permaculture makes clearly visible is that there is always this dimension of desirability. Human being is a living being that can desire very different things, as we have seen with with the food forest. So desirability is the kind of element in the systems that can completely make your provision not be followed, because the twist in desirability is powerful. So that's why, of course, it's not all about desirability, but this is a very important dimension in all these scenarios that we make about the future. Desirability is not often included.
We don't know what we will want in the future.
Exactly, but we should be aware that we can want different things from the one we want. But this is the front of the cultural change. And but with the scenarios on agriculture, people are always many scenarios are working with a stable vision of the way people eat, as if they are going to eat this way forever. But in fact, this is a variable of adjustment, which is not just adjustment, is a variable important in your simulation, desirability. And you can control this because we don't know.
Well, I actually think this is a very optimistic note to end on, because it shows that there are people out there seriously thinking in very complex ways about to, get to a much more livable future, really, beyond just, outsourcing this to politicians and thinking that it's a matter of budget allocation and things like that. Okay, we didn't get any audience questions today. I'm assuming that people have just gone out immediately to observe the ecotones around themselves and to learn from them. But I've certainly learned even more today than I learned from reading this fascinating book. So thank you very much, Laura. And I just want to end by saying that we have a very intense program of events this month, which actually continues tomorrow with a lecture by Matthew Handelman, who's Associate Professor of German in Michigan. And his talk is titled "The Rest is Silence on Mathematics and Critical Theories." Very different from what we talked about today. Thanks again, Laura. And I will see you soon. And I hope to see many of those whom we didn't see today soon at the Einstein Forum, also when we restart our in-person offline program in Potsdam. Until then,